Well, welcome everybody to week 2 of our distinguished lecture series. My name is Jeff McDonald, and on behalf of the Global Institute for Water Security and the Global Water Futures programs that are underwriting this series, I'd like to welcome all of you to this week's lecture. Next week, of course, is Brad Wilcox from Texas A&M University. And before we get going, I just want to acknowledge that we are coming to you from Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. And we pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. Today, I'm very happy to introduce a friend and colleague, Anna Barros. Anna is a distinguished professor of civil and environmental engineering at Duke University. She's been at Duke since about 2004, I think. She taught at Harvard before coming to Duke. And Anna has interests in hydrometeorology and topics linked to land-atmosphere interactions, among other things. Students in class will be reading a paper of hers in the Journal of Hydrometeorology that we've all been reading and we'll talk about in a separate class section in the hour following this talk. Anna is really a thought leader in the field, and this has come with incredible recognition. She's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, American Meteorological Society, and a fellow of the AAAS, which is quite a significant achievement. And even beyond that, a member of the National Academy of Engineering in the United States. And most important of all, she's president-elect of the AGU Hydrology section, which we are very excited about, and she'll take over the reins of the section come January 1st. And that's of personal interest to me, of course, through the succession that we've had over the years. So we're very fortunate to have Anna with us and looking forward to her talk. And Anna, without further ado, I'll turn the stage over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for your very kind introduction. And this is a very interesting experience, right? Before we start with the actual presentation, with the topic of the presentation, I just wanted to review a little bit what I mean by land-atmosphere interactions in a broad sense. And so what I am going to try to make this work. But somehow, oh, okay, great. So finally I got there. It took me some time. So when we're looking at the surface energy budget, we have important components that I'll be mentioning here. The first one is radiation, of course, net radiation. Then these interactions at the interface between the land surface and the atmosphere are governed by the temperature gradient on the land surface, and you can see from the difference of colors, for example, on the landscape how that would take place. And then the other important source of interactions are the moisture gradients. And when I think about these moisture gradients, we think of them in two parts. There's one part of that moisture gradient that will interact with the atmosphere through the energy pathway, and we have another part that is basically just a mass contribution, right? A source of moisture for the atmosphere. This latter one is usually associated with recycling studies, and of course it could be at local scales or at remote scales. But what we're going to focus on here today actually will be on the energy pathway, and that's what I will be looking at in terms of the examples of the problems we'll be studying. Just a quick reminder, this is the equation of total energy per unit mass for an air parcel in the atmosphere. And again, just to point out that the temperature gradients contribute to this energy equation through the term on the temperature, and the moisture gradients contribute through the term on latent heating. And we have looked at this in the past, long time ago, like 10 or 20 years ago. We were working on these problems and really looking at the impact of spatial heterogeneity on how these fluxes worked over different time scales. So when I now mention multi-scale land-atmosphere interactions, as you'll see, and you go through the lecture, we have come a long way in terms of modeling capabilities and how we start looking at the problems by integrating many data sources and looking at problems that are actually relevant for the broader society. So just a reminder then again, we have our adiabatic term, which is the part that we're going to focus on again here. We have a potential energy term, and we have a kinetic energy term, and this is for the total energy. This term here is going to be strongly influenced by what happens on this other term. And so if you think about this in terms, for example, of having a bucket of energy, right? The influence of this, of our latent heating term, is going to be important not because there's a lot of evaporation going on necessarily, but just because we have the enough latent heating contribution that will start, for example, convection, and that will be enough to pull moist air up mountain slopes. And so this is going to be really the focus of the remainder of our conversation. So having introduced what I mean by multi-scale land-atmosphere interactions, we're now going to focus then on what are other important sources of organization besides just the temperature gradients and moisture gradients. And mountains play a very, very important role in organizing the spatial distribution of clouds, the spatial distribution of rainfall, and in fact, the spatial distribution of vegetation. So if you look here, for example, at what the rain shadow looks like along the Western Cordillera here, you'll see that we basically have a very strong gradient in vegetation on the rain shadow side, the same thing in the case of the Himalayas. And when we look at the Andes, for example, on the eastern sides of the Andes themselves, we find a similar type of signature that is associated with the tree line. These are very tall mountains, right? And so there's very little moisture that actually gets up so high. That's why that term and how that term affects the pulling up of moisture up mountain slopes is so important. So other types of boundaries, in the case of the Andes, which we're going to focus on today, can, for example, be looked at from the International Space Stations. And so you see here, this is the Pacific side. These are the Andes again, very dry side, right on the Pacific side. And then here, all these clouds are organized along the tree line on the eastern side of the Andes. And in fact, you can do all kinds of analysis of these cloud fields, but more importantly, if you take a look, for example, at 15 years, I believe here, of TREAM data, of data from the Tropical Rainfall Measurement Mission, which was a satellite mission that was observing the tropics for a long, long time. And so these crosses are locations where precipitation features were identified during 15 years. And so what's interesting about this, right, is that if you look at these spatial patterns, for example, at night, you will notice that there's clearly concentration of these precipitation features within some ranges of elevation. Here, this is between 500 meters and 3,000 meters. And then during the day, the same thing happens. And one thing that I want to point out is to please notice this area here at these elevations that is so dry. So over 15 years of satellite observations over this region, never a precipitation feature was observed in this range. So this is basically the symptom of a rain shadow region, which is above the tree line. So you can see, so no matter how you look at these landscapes, you find these sorts of elements of strong spatial organization. Now, in the Andes, this is really important because associated with the precipitation features, associated with the cloud features, you also find that the landscape itself is, because of erosion patterns, is strongly modulated by the spatial distribution of precipitation. So we're going to look at that little yellow square there, and what you see here, this is a plot of the density of those precipitation features that I showed you in the previous slide, according to elevation on the Ucayali River Basin. And so it's a very interesting feature. You can see that at low elevations, we have a high number of precipitation features, and that's really related to convective activity in the Amazon along the eastern slopes of the Andes. Then there's an increase up to about 1,500 meters or so, and then there's a decrease, and then later up here, we see more features that are associated with the altiplano that we're not going to focus on today. So what's interesting about this now is that if you look at the river systems in this landscape, we will find that the distribution of stream orders, and especially in particular the distribution of stream orders of number 1, actually matches very, very well. It's almost a one-to-one relationship with the spatial distribution of precipitation features. So what this is telling us is that precipitation really is the most important landscape forming agent in this region of the world. So any changes in the spatial distribution of precipitation and before that in the spatial distribution of clouds, of course, will have significant impact on the landscape in many different ways, right? So we're going to focus then on trying to look at how thermodynamics, and so basically these marsh processes in the atmosphere, organize water transport and how it moves and it is transformed. And in doing so, it organizes basically our landscapes. So we'll be focusing on the Andes, as you can tell. And just to start, I'm sure you may have seen this. This is a picture on the left-hand side by Humboldt, who was an explorer and went around in Central America and South America, and he made all these amazingly insightful diagrams, right, of mountains and actually of the Amazon itself, and then the distribution of vegetation along those mountains, including going from the rainforest up to the snow peaks. And so this is his conceptual description, but that's very close to what we actually see today. And related to, this is his tree line. This is our tree line that we can now see from satellite, of course. But, but basically nothing much in almost 200 years really changed in terms of mapping what goes on in this region of the world. So what I'll be focusing on is really on that area where we have the green circle, because most of the modeling applications I'll show will be focused in that area. And in this area, I wanted to point out another feature that is very, very important for us, which is the cloud line. And that's the line where clouds can form, the highest line along a landscape where clouds can still form. So, in fact, that's what's really controlling where the tree line is. So the cloud line eventually determines where the tree line is, because some of the trees that we find at very high elevation are actually taking up water, not from the soil through the roots, but actually from the leaves, directly from fog and from cloud immersion. Now, this is the sunrise looking down on the Amazon from our network. We have a network of rain gauges that goes from about 4,000 meters down to the Amazon in this region of the Andes. And as you can see, when we got at very early in the morning, when we're looking down, we have no clouds at higher elevations, and everything is pushed down into the Amazon. But then at sunset, we actually have pulled a lot of this moisture up the slopes, and then we have this sort of cloud line forming where we are close, very close to the tree line. And this is just a picture of the ridge line into the Amazon, where we have our network observations, which consist basically with gauges on towers. So going back to the picture that we were looking at before in terms of Humboldt, this is our distribution of our towers along with elevation. And as part of some interesting work that that I was involved in with some colleagues in ecology, the question of what was the role of vegetation in actually maintaining this cloud line came up. And so the question is the tree line actually bringing the cloud line up, or is the cloud line really maintaining the tree line? So one of the things that we did a few years ago was a study on evapotranspiration suppression. And so in this case, what we focused on was to basically look at the entire mountain range, and the hatched area you see there is the area of where the forests are along the eastern Andes. And so what my student actually did here, we didn't cut the trees, we didn't take them away, but what he did was he rewrote the WRF PBL scheme in such a way that we could precisely identify where each parcel of water was after leaving the land surface. And then after being able to do that, what we did was to extract, like a surgeon, all the water out, but maintaining everything else the same. And so the idea here in these experiments was to really find out what was the impact of moisture? Because when you take a thermodynamics class, you always learn that moisture is heat. So when we're bringing in moisture into the atmosphere, we're bringing in heat. And with that heat, we bring in instability. So we wanted to find out exactly how that what kind of impact that would have, maintaining everything else the same, surface roughness, surface temperature, everything else the same. So basically, every few seconds or so, my student went into model output and extracted the moisture from the boundary layer, leaving everything else the same, restarted the code, doing it all over again. So 150 terabytes of data later, we could look at some of these experiments and assess what is the true impact of this moisture from evapotranspiration along the hill slopes on atmospheric instability, for example. And what we found was that if you look at this, for example, at 1 p.m. local standard time, which is basically midday, you see that the impact of doing that is on the order of 1,500 joules per kilogram in Cape. So with 1,500 joules per kilogram, you can actually produce a huge storm system, a mesoscale system. And so this is actually a lot of instability just associated with this very narrow slice of forests along the Andes. And then if you look at the impact on precipitation, and now we're focusing on this region here that you see highlighted in green. So what we found was very interesting, right? Well, it was expected in some ways, but it was interesting nonetheless. So instead of doing climate model simulations that would require many, many years and so on, what we did was we focused on representative weather conditions that really bring in most of the precipitation, or that are representative of the regional hydrometeorology. So we picked all of these sorts of conditions. These two are sort of in the spring, when it doesn't rain much anymore in in South America. This is very dry. This is for winter conditions, and these two are the most important, types of organization of circulation in the Amazon during the monsoon. So this is a weak low-level jet case, and this is a strong low-level jet case, and these were very well characterized by other colleagues in previous work. And so what you see here is that the impact of having extracted that moisture is basically equivalent to reducing the precipitation by about 50% in terms of how much rainfall you actually produce from these weather systems on our hatchet area. So a loss of 1,500 joules per kilogram of energy of instability really converts here into a decrease of 50% of precipitation decrease, which looks like a lot, right? But you remember that when I started, I said, well, these interactions are going to take place in two ways. One of them, we're focusing on evaporation really for all practical purposes. And of course, when we're looking at the moisture budget, we have precipitation as input, our transient term here, but this term here is the moisture convergence term. So this term really represents the upslope convergence of moisture into the Andes. And what you'll see if you look at these cases is that in the cases when we have moist processes on, which are these two cases here during the monsoon, we see that, yes, there's different influence in terms of mass, but the real impact here is not because of mass, but it's rather because of energy change. And so the impact is going to be on the strong decrease of moisture convergence, and you can actually look at this on a profiled point of view, and that decrease of moisture convergence is happening around 800 millibars or so. It's peaking at 800 millibars, which is really where most of the upslope moisture in the Andes is taking place. So you can think about this in a way as if the vegetation, right, as if the trees were really the gatekeepers of this upslope moisture convergence in the mountains. And so how important it is that they are where they are, right? They play a very important role. So at sunset, we can have our cloud line forming. And so you can play all kinds of games with these types of model simulations and actually track parcels that are launched at different times of day and see where they end up. And in fact, our hypothesis bears out. And in the end, this is the so-called Alpine Hypothesis for the role of vegetation in weather and hydrometeorology of mountainous regions, and that montane forests actually pump the low-level moisture that is in the foreplains to form daytime level clouds and fog in the inner mountain region, and so they play a very important role actually in the local distribution of water. So now we're going to make a small change and look at land use, land cover change in this region for about 4,000 or 5,000 years. So these are two maps. The one on the right shows what is the reconstructed distribution of vegetation and forests in particular in this region 4,000 years ago. And on the left, this is what you have. It's basically, we had the Inca civilization and all kinds of things happening after that at higher elevations. And so you can see basically that there has been a complete deforestation of the higher elevations. In about 20 years ago, there was really very little left. So what's interesting about this then is that you can see, we can look at our graph that we were looking at before, where we have our stations, and we can place in terms of the vegetation, how it's organized on the mountain slope, in terms of historical change, which has been depressed and pushed down historically from the higher elevations down to the lower elevations. And then we can look at this from the point of view of most recent data. This is some work I was privileged to work with colleagues who are ecologists and look at large scale vegetation distribution. And so from this work, looking at the recent only 10 years, because we were using satellite data, what we found is that there's actually ongoing pressure now to eliminate or to degrade the vegetation. And you have heard about all the fires going on in the Amazon and the pressure for deforestation and for agriculture and for other more nefarious activities. And so there's a push now going on from the lower elevations to pushing the vegetation and the forest upward. So we did some analysis based on the satellite data. And so what you can actually see is that whereas there's been some increases in some locations in terms of the vegetation because of the huge effort that RED and other initiatives are putting in the region, but what this has not really stopped is the elimination, right, and the deforestation at lower elevations. So then, based on these results, which are very targeted and very localized, we formulated a hypothesis that basically says, well, if we get rid of the vegetation at these lower levels, then this will have an impact on upslope moisture convergence, because we've done that through those idealized studies I've talked about before. And what's the implication of this? The implication will be a squeeze of geographic freshwater harvesting zone, which is basically the zone where you can form clouds and you can have rain. And of course, if you have an impact on rainfall, then you'll have a strong impact on material fluxes. This is really very important here because the Andes are the supply that nurses the Amazon, right? So the Amazon basin at lower elevations, all the way from Brazil through from the Andes to the Atlantic Ocean is really maintained by this erosion that comes from the higher elevations in the Andes. So a change in precipitation in the Andes does not only affect water resources locally and ecosystems locally, but has a very important effect at macro scale in this region. So that's exactly what we set up to really test here, and these are more delicate tests. And actually, the paper is in review, and hopefully will be accepted, very soon. But so what we did was basically the same experiment that we had done before, but now in a more realistic way. So basically, here we looked at the areas that were still with evergreen, broadleaf, and mixed forest areas, and we replaced them by that equivalent of savanna, which is really happening here in these regions where we have lots of agricultural activity and just basically deforestation in the Western Amazon. So this is a very delicate experiment because, as you can see now, before we did a replacement of this entire region, right? When we extracted, we didn't do a replacement experiment, we extracted the moisture. Now we're actually doing a replacement, and in these green areas, we're replacing whatever is left of the evergreen forest by savanna, basically reproducing what is going on in the region right now. And so the events, again, we focused on the idea that we're not going to do this at climate scale because, it would not be possible, but we're going to do this using evaluating the behavior for rain-producing weather systems that we know are important regionally. And we're going to treat this as a boundary value problem. Basically, the idea is that we don't really care if the precipitation is right at location X, Y, Z, and time T, but we care whether the processes that we see changing because of the land cover changing are the same everywhere and in the same way. So we're really focusing at whether the mechanisms are the same. So focusing on processes and not focusing on the stochasticity of weather conditions that sometimes is overwhelming. Not here, but still, it's an important point to make. The other thing that I wanted to point out again is that, as I said before, these kinds of changes, because mass is not important here, we don't have enough mass to make a difference and to impact recycling over the Andes. Recycling is important in the Amazon basin proper, but it's not important over the Andes. In the Andes, evapotranspiration is really making an important contribution through the pathway of energy, through instability. And so what we expect is that role is going to be played where moist processes are important in the atmosphere. And so in the areas where we have already high instability and where this contribution will tip the bucket one way or another, as we saw in the first slide. And so just to give you an example, so these are results for, one of them is for January of 2003, and the other one is for February of 2003. And so these are two cases for the monsoon, weak low-level jet conditions, strong low-level jet conditions. And what you're going to see is the impact on Cape here. Let's just focus on this one because this one is very, very small. And so, but what you'll see then is that no matter what we do, independently of the weather system we're looking at, as long as we have moisture processes governing what's going on in the atmosphere, you'll see that these changes are actually governing where the changes in instability are happening. And it's very, very clearly localized and very coordinated, right? So this makes sense because that's exactly what we expected to see as well. And now I'm showing you results from a different case, which is actually a very important type of weather system in South America, and which we really only realized how important it was in terms of precipitation through a publication that my student actually had last year, and these are these cold air intrusions. So these cold air intrusions are events that happen all year long, and so basically in these events we have a very strong front. And so the hypothesis in this case would be that these sorts of interactions, the impact on instability distribution would always be ahead of the front and never behind the front, because behind the front we have cold, dry air, whereas where these sorts of impacts would be important would be where we have moist, warm air. And thus ahead of the front. And again, even in such a complex case like this one, we again see exactly the same type of behavior as a function of the areas where we have moist processes dominating. Now, what's important about this is that by doing these types of experiments and looking at different types of representative weather systems, what we find is that overall, one of the major conclusions is this shift in the precipitation maxima from the slopes into the foreplane. So we have a movement of the cumulative rainfall from independently of the type of weather system, by about 50 to 100 kilometers. This doesn't look like much anywhere. It's a lot when we're looking at very, very steep mountains, right? Because that means that basically the rain is falling in a completely different climatic region. The other thing that's, I should have been more careful with this, I suppose. So then what we wanted to look at was the impact not only on the rainfall accumulation, but actually on the type of rainfall. And so to do this, we divided that region of interest, the region that is orographically active along the Andes, in different elevation bands. And so the pink is for 500 meters. This one here, reddish, is about 1,000 meters, and the green is at about 1,500 meters or so. And then we looked at how did these changes impact the PDF of rainfall intensity. And so what you'll find is that in every case, and then we did lots of experiments trying different initial conditions and so on, but what you generally find is this shift of precipitation intensity from moderate rain rates to much lighter rain rates. And that is statistically significant with p-values of 0.0001. And you see that for all kinds of systems. So in summary, what we see then is a shift of the precipitation accumulation down slope into the Amazon, and this shift in the precipitation intensity distributions. By the way, these results are not conclusive at all for the heavy precipitation rates because, of course, we're using a numerical weather prediction model that cannot simulate because of its parameterizations, very heavy rainfall. So I wouldn't read too much into what happens in terms of the high amounts, just really focusing on what we can do and can do well. So then our hypothesis can be refined then, right? So what we see now is that these changes in precipitation are again pushing the precipitation downslope and changing the type of precipitation from moderate rainfall to light rainfall. So what are the implications of this really? I am going to just go quickly over this slide to show that those events, the types of events that I was showing you before, these cold air intrusions, we actually, through this climatology study, which we're able to identify that they are actually associated with the heaviest precipitation in the Andes. And this is an all-season phenomenon. So without TRIM and without our surface network, actually with both, right, with having a satellite and having a ground-based observing system, by combining both observations and to really help us formulate hypotheses, we're able to make this discovery. And this is very, very important because these types of systems are actually the ones for which the change in vegetation makes a stronger impact in terms of the rainfall output. So we're actually, this deforestation has a huge impact because the impact is also stronger on the types of weather systems that are more sensitive to this type of land-atmosphere interaction. And so, just to give you an example, for this region, I showed you earlier that distribution of the precipitation features and the distribution of the streams of order 1 in the central Andes. This is the Ucayali River, which is a tributary of the Marañón and then into the Amazon. This is what the Ucayali looks like, and so you can tell from the color how high the sediment concentration is in this river. And geomorphologists love to study this river because also the color of the river, the flow, the shape of the meanders and so on changes very strongly, for example, with El Nino activity, so basically very responsive to rainfall. So just to give you an idea then, for these studies we did, the change in runoff integrated over the basin for one of these CAI events, for these cold air intrusion events, is the same as the average flow in this river, in the spring, in the austral spring, which is the fall for us. So we don't have many of these events. We have maybe somewhere between 4 and 10 in each season. And so if each one of these events is going to be so strongly impacted, then you can see that this potentially could dramatically change the regional hydroclimate. And in fact, there's some beginning evidence of that this may be happening, although a lot of this deforestation is still fortunately not close enough to the area that could be most critical. But this is a study by Espinosa et al. That was published last year, where they're trying to understand what's going on in this region. And what they're trying to focus on is really, they do water budgets in this paper, for example, and they find that if you look at precipitation in the last decade, say, versus what happened earlier on, you don't actually significant changes. And there are some changes in runoff, right? But it's not a dramatic change. However, when they did some more careful analysis and focused on something like the runoff coefficient, right? Then they see a dramatic change in the runoff coefficient. And I highlighted here this, the Austral Spring, which is really October for us. And this is evidence of the same type of behavior that we were seeing before, right? So we see, and because you would get this kind of change in the runoff coefficient if you have a change in the type of precipitation regime you're actually experiencing. So even though the amount of total precipitation, which is, of course, there are huge uncertainties in these estimates, but even though the amount of total precipitation may not be significantly different, the way that precipitation happens is actually so different that is impacting how we look at the water cycle in this region. Now, the implications, of course, the other practical implications of this are huge. This is actually an old graphic that I took from a paper in Science that had at the time this distribution of dams along the Andes and, of course, into the Amazon, and several of them have already going on. So I want to point out that this line, this is almost like building a wall, right, along the Andes that effectively is retaining sediment behind. But so this effect, composed with the effect that we have in terms of land cover changes, could potentially really change the balance of water and materials in this region in a very significant and interesting way, right? And this is the type of considerations. These are the types of considerations that you don't often see in environmental impact studies, right? So every single dam down here and every dam around here, it has an environmental impact assessment study done. But unfortunately, the way, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, the way we do environmental impact assessments is really focused on the project and very much so in the local region of interest, and not so much having this more broader perspective that we have been able to develop over the last 20, 30 years that really brings the entire continent to bear on these kinds of decisions, right? And so I was going to talk a little bit about the implications of these results for other studies, and I will probably pass on this though because it's already time, and so some other time. I do want to show you though these results. These are from similar experiments that we did for the Andes. We did them for the Amazon, and these experiments are expressed in terms of change of total evapotranspiration. And so, as you would expect in the Amazon, recycling is very important. So if you take away the moisture, the evapotranspiration, the contribution from the trees, then we of course would expect to see very strong decreases in the precipitation, and we would expect to see increases if we increase it. But what's really interesting is that by changing what happens in the Amazon, we change the full diurnal cycle of precipitation over the mountains. And so this is another upstream impact that is not often considered. So deforestation in the Amazon is important not only because it impacts, of course, rainfall in the Amazon, and but also because it can potentially impact, right, the diurnal cycle of precipitation and clouds, and therefore surface energy balance, and so therefore ecosystems, the livelihood of people and animals and so on in the mountains in unexpected ways. Again, these are the sorts of feedbacks that we oftentimes don't consider in these these large-scale environmental impact studies. And just to finish here, and this is really my last slide with some results. And I always show this because I was fascinated by it, and I think others might be too. So these are results from a climatology of low-level clouds over the southern Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. This is just to the west of us. And so you can see, and so this was done based on season, and these are all daytime clouds. And so this is the area of the Great Smoky Mountains. I don't know if you've heard about this before, but there's lots of clouds in this region, and there's clouds at midday everywhere and fog at midday everywhere. So it's beautiful, and the forests are fantastic, and so on. And so we can actually see that the presence of those clouds. So this is the frequency of those cloud decks over this region in terms of the number of days over June, July, and August. And so you see every other day or every 1.2 days or so, we actually have a cloud deck that can be observed from Moody's, which means it's pretty thick. But what I thought was fascinating was to see these features at lower elevations, right? Which means you never have clouds here at midday, right? From the climatology, and that's true in the spring, and it's true in the summer. So in the beginning, when we first saw this, and of course we were not thinking about the land surface at all, we were not really, what's going on? How, where are these things coming from? And what turns out is that this here is the TVA a dam system. So there are several dams built on the Tennessee River, and so over each one of these dams, this is actually in the Savannah, also dams on the western side here. And so every one of these dots of these areas is actually a major reservoir for one of these dams. And so what you see is that in the afternoon, we have land breezes, or basically lake breezes in this case. And so the convection and the cumulus clouds are forming along the sides of these reservoirs and not on the reservoir. This is another impact, right, of anthropogenic change on the landscape. And by the way, this area was intensely used, so it was deforested heavily, and in the beginning of the century, and then it evolved into a national park. And so a lot of this vegetation is actually recent vegetation. So you can see how it would have been very difficult to anticipate 100 years ago how building these dams would completely change the regional hydroclimate in this area. And it has impacts for microphysics. I'll move on from there. And I'll stop here. If you ask me questions, I can show some of those other slides. But again, I wanted to bring this point. This is the 50 years of the National Environmental Protection Act. It was this year on the 1st of January. And so this is how environmental impact statement assessments started anywhere in the world. Actually, the US was a leader in that sense. And however, I think we haven't really looked at how we do these environmental impact assessments at scales that really allow us to account for these very remote interactions in our landscapes. And so I'll finish here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anna. That was really a tour de force of kind of Amazon basin hydrology. And my bust of Humboldt that sits next to my computer always is very happy. In fact, I think he's smiling now.
Yes, I can see that.
So we'll open it up to any comments or questions. We've got about 10 minutes. And I think we'll do this by the chat. I think Kim is there. Others are standing by. And we'll look forward to perhaps hearing any questions that people might have. Maybe I could start off with, so interesting, these precipitation patterns and your model results. I'm wondering, if you've used stable isotopes as a way to test your model assumptions. I know there's a isotope-enabled NOAA MP now available. I think it was Francina Dominguez,
Dominguez, yeah.
Yeah, whose group
Yeah.
has developed that. But I wonder if that could be kind of like independent information to also say something about the movement, the source areas of precipitation, because of course you can sample vapor as well as liquid. Has that been tried at all?
Yeah, so Carlos Nobre from Brazil, he really started this kind of work in the Amazon like 30 or 40 years ago. So the first work looking at isotopes in that region started long time ago. And yes, we have not looked at it in this region, but we have looked at it in the Himalayas when we had our field experiment in the Himalayas. So actually we had these boxes and boxes of little bottles of water. And so during some field campaigns, we had the students would just be there. And when it started raining, we would be sampling actually at different time steps. So you could see the evolution, right? You could see the signal of convection and then the signal of the stratiform part of these storms actually show up in the isotopes. It's more complicated, I think, to really do it in the integrated sense, right? Looking at it from a hydrology perspective, because then you need to really be sampling for a long time and so on. So yes, no, we haven't looked at these effects here, but yes, yeah, we have thought about this. Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing a question here. From Diego, are you looking at Incan terraces for your crop fields or current crop locations?
So we're not looking at crops per se. So we have a network that goes from the top of Manu National Park down to the Amazon. And it's really in the tradition of the sort of measurements we do, which is to do mountain envelope measurements. So we can really see what is the change in the moisture convergence and in precipitation along the mountain slopes. But we have looked, because this is really interesting, right? The Inca were very smart. And so they had these amazing sort of structures that they would build where they created ponds distributed, for example, in the Altiplano area. And those ponds were essential, again, because of land-atmosphere interactions. They provided enough moisture to keep the boundary layer just warm enough to avoid frost, right? And so to be able to keep the crops going and keep your the animals fed and so on. And so it's really fascinating to see, because also those ponds are sort of designed in a way that they are at a very characteristic distance from each other. So they really engineered, maybe not in the way that we think about engineering these days, right, with the ruler and so on, but very well thought. Very good question.
Well, in fact, two more questions about ponds, one from Kumar and one from Graham Strickert, just talking about evaporation. The first one, wondering if it leads to cloudburst events. Well, maybe this is in the Himalayas, but the other one talking about, dam construction or deconstruction and its effects locally. Yeah, I guess just speaking more to, some of these feedbacks with reservoirs and influencing some of your...
Usually, whenever I talk about mountains and mountain weather, there's always somebody in the audience who's from India or from Nepal or Pakistan, and they have this experience of the cloudbursts, right? So these are massive, very heavy rainfall events that tend to happen in the middle of the night. So oftentimes, I don't know if this is the case with Kumar, but that's a story I always hear, is how somebody was asleep and they woke up in the middle of the night, and it's always always very fascinating. So those are associated with cold pool developing and during the monsoon, this interaction between warm, moist air and the cold pool, and they actually develop along a very specific region also in the mountains, right? So it's not a random process, that they don't happen at very high elevations, they don't happen at very low elevations either. And so we actually map those, and they have to do with the geometry, right, of nighttime flows and the availability of moisture that is present during the monsoon.
Yeah.
In the Andes, these cold air intrusion events sort of do that in a different way, in that the front, as it interacts with the mountains, at the tip of the front is gliding over the mountains, and at the tip, that's where we found those very heavy events. So we actually registered an event that was the size of Hurricane Katrina over a 10 square kilometer area where we have our network.
Yeah.
And, and it's one of those things that if you're not there to measure, you would never know ever that happened. So there were lots of landslides, hundreds of landslides. But of course, if we hadn't measured it, we wouldn't have known.
Yeah, fascinating. Here's one from kind of the other end of the spectrum from John Pomeroy. Can you comment on the mega drought that's affecting the Chilean Andes and whether the reduction in ET due to low precipitation near the Andes is also sustaining this drought in the Andes?
So I'm going to be very careful here, because I think, what goes on in Chile is significantly different from the processes that play a role in the Western Amazon basin proper. So when we're talking about Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and so on, those types of processes along that eastern slopes barrier are significantly different from what goes on in Chile, and so on. Although on the western side of the mountains in Argentina, you do see these differences. So I think in that case, and I haven't looked at that carefully, but I think it has to also do with interannual, climate variability or decadal climate variability, and on how Rossby waves coming from the Pacific actually bring moisture into Chile or not, and that plays a huge role in what goes on in that area.
Yeah. Good. Well, Anna, we have several more questions, but we're running out of time.
So there's a question on chat about environmental impact statements.
Yeah.
Well, this is a very good question, right? And I want to take the opportunity. That's why I really want to answer this question.
Sure. We'll end with this one.
I want to take the opportunity to bring up the point that environmental impact statements are really important, and of course there's a lot of legislation that goes with these environmental impact statements. However, in terms of what is the scale at which you're going to look at change, right, is always very limited, and it's always assumed that you build something or you change something, right, and that's going to impact a certain area, but these long remote impacts are not accounted for. And at the same time, somewhere else, somebody's doing an environmental impact assessment and doing exactly the same study over a very small area. But if you do this over 100 small areas and all the environmental impact assessment studies are fine individually, then you put them together, you're actually changing a whole region. Yeah. Right? And that then the cumulative nonlinear effect of that should be taken into consideration. And unfortunately, I don't think our environmental protection agencies are not organized to think about that way. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's an issue in large watersheds generally. It's how those cumulative impacts, for instance, in the headwaters, express themselves at larger and larger scales. So Anna, we're out of time, but I want to thank you on behalf again of the Global Institute for Water Security and the Global Water Futures Project for spending time with us. As you know, we're going to segue now to the Journal Club on Zoom. This is with students in the class, and we'll look forward to seeing you there again shortly. But for everyone else, we're going to say goodbye and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week with Brad Wilcox from Texas A&M. Thanks so much, Anna.
Thank you, everyone.